Greetings friends and welcome to the story of the world that was. I'm Lorcan and this is Only War. In this episode of the history of the old world, we'll cover the story of how the greatest necromancer the world has ever seen engaged in bitter conflicts with a newly emerged race, while in his former homeland, his nemesis would begin the path of ascension to the throne. This is a more in-depth story than some in the series, as we discuss the war for Cripple Peak and the death of the Blessed Lands. I hope you enjoy the retelling of these truly momentous events in the history of the old world. At the end of our last tale, the exiled Nagash, the undying king, had consolidated his hold on Cripple Peak, and using the warp stone mined from its depths, his undead minions had raised his great fortress of Nagashazar, while he plotted his revenge and a war against the kingdoms that had cast him out. However, unbeknownst to the great necromancer, an insidious force was already mobilizing against him, not for the crimes of his past, but to wrestle from him the source of his fell power. Meanwhile, in Neferata, the once blessed land ravaged by Nagash's reign of terror, in the city of Lahmia, Neferata and her vampire court exerted their control over all the city kingdoms, and held as her ward the prince, whose fate would be entwined both with the vampire queen and the great necromancer. Before we get started, a huge thank you to my supporters on Patreon whose contributions help keep me bringing you these tales of the old world and the 41st millennium. The Patreon and other ways you can support Only War are in the description, and every dollar is greatly appreciated. Whether you, like me, have held love for both settings for longer than you care to remember, or you're just starting on your path into the world that was, if you enjoy this series, please hit the like button and leave an offering in praise of the usurper in the comments section. If you're new here, thank you for joining us, and I hope I earn your subscription today. The year is 1325 before the coming of Sigmar. On the shores of the Crystal Sea stood a great mountain, once known by the local nomadic tribes as Agharul, the place of oaths. And then, following the impact of a huge warpstone meteorite that drove generations of their chieftains to descend into tyrannical madness as Aghal Nahmad, the place of sorrows. Eventually, the people known as the Yaghur, the Faithful, would overthrow their ruling kings and their corrupted priests and travel north, leaving the desolate mountain behind a haunted place, shrouded in toxic mists from the great meteorite of crystallized chaos energy buried at the heart of the mountain. So it remained for centuries, until from the west a wretched, shambling corpse of a man, clad in the tattered remnants of fallen grandeur, was drawn to its fell power, seeking a means to regain all he had lost. He was Nagash the Usurper, the great necromancer, and once he began to exploit the warpstone for his own ends, he raised a legion of corpses from the ancient burial grounds of the Yaghur, and demanded fealty from the tainted tribes that still scratched a meager existence along the shores of the Crystal Sea. In little over 2 centuries, the mountain was transformed. The necromancer's undead minions and living slaves carved great networks of tunnels and mine workings within the very core of the mountain. At the surface, a great city fortress encased in 7 high stone walls belched thick smoke and poisonous ash into the sky to mix with the noxious vapors that emanated from the warp-tainted mountain. Toxic runoff from the construction and workings of the fortress passed through the burial fields that surrounded the mountain and drained into the Crystal Sea, blighting the area further. He named his fortress Nagash, the glory of Nagash in the ancient tongue of Neferata, the land he both loathed and desired to rule more than any other. Nagash himself was much changed from the man he once was. His skin was that of a long-buried corpse, dark and leathery, and the flesh contained within was now twisted and misshapen. In place of eyes, he now had two cold, baleful green flames that flickered in the depths of a hooded cowl, adorned with arcane symbols and medallions of bronze enchanted with sigils of protection. From his throne in Nagash, his schemes of vengeance would be enacted. Nagash would choke the life from the world and rule in the eternal darkness that would follow, and Neferata would be the first to fall. Despite his great power, Nagash still had need of living vassals, and as such he had subjugated what remained of the Yaghur tribes and demanded a tithe of men to guard the walls of his fortress. And when they died, their corpses would serve him in death in his mines. These flesh and blood servants were led by a former warlord, a powerful man known as Braghat, who was counseled by Akathar, one of the last fierce tribal witches to survive the conquering of their people. Nagash tasked the warlord with the training of the tribesmen in the arts of warfare, so they could engage the disciplined Neferatan infantry as equals, rather than berserk savages, when he marched his forces on his former homeland. Bragha besieged Nagash to allow a contingent of his fighting men to campaign against the Greenskin tribes in the northern mountains, to allow them to be blooded in real combat before the campaign to come. Cautious of treachery, Nagash agreed, but Bragha would not lead the force away from Nagash. Instead, he would place a man known as Thestus in charge. Thestus was one of the first tribes to bend the knee to Nagash, and had known nothing but the rule of the great necromancer his entire life. Bragha balked at this command and retracted his request to send the men north. But war would soon come to Nagash itself, not from the mountains or plains, but from below. Thousands of feet below Nagash's great hall, in the dark, dank caverns and half-finished galleries, a mighty host gathered. A sea of armored, dark-furred bodies spread through the deeps, awaiting the call to flood towards the upper levels and reclaim its warpstone riches for their masters and the glory of the Horned Rat. Ygritte Backbiter, Lord of Clan Rikek, and master of the largest Skaven army ever assembled, was poised expectantly to give that command. The discovery of the vast wealth of warpstone under the mountain had driven the Grey Lords of Skaven Blight into a decades-long frenzy of treachery and murder, before the Sheer Lord Grimon had intervened, and an uneasy alliance formed that resulted in contingents of warriors from each of the 12 great clans joining the expeditionary force. The reports from Ygritte's scouts led him to believe that only a few thousand walking corpses stood between him and victory, their presence explained by his master of war engines, a Clanskyle warlock known as Vitric One-Eye, as the remnants of a long-dead kingdom, the bodies of slave miners animated by the energies of the warp stone they were tasked by their masters to gather, and doomed to repeat for all eternity. The warlord cared not. His forces outnumbered the undead 10-1, and he was more concerned, as any sensible Skaven is, with the possible machinations of his closest allies. Amongst his host he had Lord Hirik, a young lieutenant who was little more than a figurehead for the most powerful of the great clans, Clan Morbus, his tall and lean master of treacheries, Lord Eshrigar, who commanded the companies of scout assassins, and Lord Queequol, who was the representative of the Grey Seers. Queequol's selection was seen as a concession to the Grey Lords on the Council of 13, who suspected the Grey Seers may attempt to turn the expedition to the benefit of themselves and their Seer Lord should the opportunity arise. As such, the ancient and warpstone-addled Lord Queequol was seen as little threat by most. Ygritte had his doubts though, as Queequol had been the previous Seer Lord, and had voluntarily retired from the position in favour of Grimon, rather than being removed by the usual Skaven means. Ygritte would receive word through his Master of Treacheries that all was in readiness, and would issue the order to the chieftains to commence the assault on the mines of Nagash, still unaware of the true might of the foe he was about to engage. Amidst a cacophony of brass bells and war horns, thousands of clawed feet marched forward in a verminous tide, guided through the maze of tunnels by the black-cloaked scouts towards their objectives. The horde of rat-men erupted from the depths into the shadowy corridors of Nagash's great fortress. The lower levels were mostly deserted and the Skaven made rapid progress, reaching the deepest mine shafts in mere minutes. Vastly outnumbering the skeletal labourers they encountered, the majority of Skaven casualties were those inflicted as the clan rats squabbled over any warp stone they discovered, or took advantage of the heaving press of bodies to silently settle old rivalries. However, the advantage of surprise would only last so long, and as they ascended through the levels, the resistance they faced began to increase. Where once only isolated parties of undead labourers were discovered, now with increasing frequency the emerging Skaven would be greeted by an organised phalanx of tool-wielding skeletons, although even then the defenders were quickly overrun and dismembered. 2 hours into the assault, the warriors of Clan Morbus reached the highest mine shafts. There the advance faltered as the Skaven were met by packed ranks of spear-wielding skeletons, wearing tattered but functional armour. The tunnels were soon choked with bones and bleeding Skaven bodies, but the whips and snarls of the chieftains at their backs kept the clan rats pressing forwards. When the last of the defenders were overwhelmed at the entrances of the topmost mine shafts, the victorious Skaven found the tunnels nearly devoid of plunder. These upper mine shafts were long since played out, but foraging parties set forth through the tunnel branches, determined to discover where the warpstone riches could have been taken to. That they did not return did not raise any alarm in the chieftains until savage, blood-curdling howls began to echo down the tunnels, and a small handful of foragers returned covered in grievous wounds. And then, over the maddened shrieks from the upper passageways came the eerie wail of horns, and the sound of thousands of skeletal feet, marching in unison as a bitter wind gusted down the tunnels, heavy with the dusty scent of ancient death. At first, Nagash had been unconcerned by the loss of a handful of minions in the lowest depths of his fortress complex. Only when those in the mine shafts began to vanish did he realize an attack was underway. Sending his awareness out to the skeletal labourers toiling in the lower levels, he was able to catch the faintest glimpse of his foe before his minions were destroyed. He saw the seething mass of dark-furred bodies, clutching crude bronze swords and spears, red beady eyes glinting in the scattered light of lanterns, and the snapping of curved, chisel-like teeth before his connection to his minions was lost, and he knew the nature of his enemy. Nagash had only encountered the rat men in small scavenging parties far to the west of his fortress. Now there was an army of them, and their desire to possess the warpstone riches of his mountain enraged him. He vowed to first slaughter those who had dared set foot in his domain, and then follow any survivors back to their lair to wipe them from existence. Sending his mighty will out through his fortress, his undead minions silently answered his call to arms before the ominous tolling of the alarm gongs resounded out to marshal his living warriors. The Northmen commanded by Bragard, and those who were once the Yaghur that lived in the shadows of the mountain. Those southern tribesmen who in centuries past descended into cannibalism and were now hairless, misshapen monstrosities, with little vestige of their former humanity remaining. The alarm gongs and the howls of their brethren echoed down the mountain slopes where it reached the ears of the tribes of the corrupted flesh-eaters. They loped, ape-like, across the fetid marshes to answer their master's call. Seeing the rapid rate of the Skaven assault, Nagash knew he needed to stall for time. Otherwise the rat men would not only overrun his mine complex, but possibly enter the upper levels of the fortress before he could marshal his forces. He dispatched several large companies of skeletal spearmen into the upper mine shafts to bog down the Skaven advance. If he could keep them trapped like rats underground, he could grind the vermin down under the relentless march of his undead minions. The great necromancer then filled the upper tunnels with spearmen and hundreds of his ghoulish flesh-eaters, while his barbarian warriors sealed off the surface exits of each of the mountain's mineshafts. Once the Skaven of Clan Morbius had finally overrun the upper mineshafts, Nagash exerted his mastery of the foul Yaghur, and the flesh-eaters crept silently down into the dimly lit tunnels, to lie in ambush for any Skaven scouting parties advancing towards the fortress. It was the survivors of these parties that stumbled, bleeding, back to the main body of their force, but by then, Nagash was already on the offensive. His Yaghur struck first, sowing terror and confusion through the ratmen's ranks, as the air vibrated with the sounds of bone horns and the trampling of feet, as his companies of skeleton spears descended into the upper mine shafts, sending the Skaven into a panicked retreat almost immediately. Back in the great cavern in which the Skaven had mustered for their assault, the first troubling reports started to trickle back to Lord Ykrit. His master of treacheries was forced to admit they had underestimated the strength of the undead, not by a few hundred, but by the 1,000. Clan Morbus was in full retreat, and the upper mine shafts had been retaken by the dead. However, his greater fear was the wrath of the council should his offensive fail. The cunning warlord reassessed the situation, knowing the overwhelming weight of numbers was still on his side, and consulted his map of the tunnels once more, seeking a way to strike back at his foe. Nagash's troops were relentless, the great necromancer's will driving them forward despite the increasing resistance the Skaven were mustering as they were pushed deeper into the mine works. His barbarian warriors held the surface entrances, penning the Skaven in as he had planned, and he had yet more living infantry held in reserve. What troubled Nagash was he was yet to ascertain the true strength of the Skaven army, and he started to suspect his enemy of being much more suited to this subterranean style of warfare. They also seemed to know the layout of his realm almost as well as he did, which led him to wonder how long they had dwelled beneath his feet, awaiting the moment to strike. Nagash had reclaimed all but a handful of the deepest mine shafts, but here was where the enemy tactics became more sophisticated, and their counterattacks more determined. Packs of his flesh-eaters were lured into ambushes, and his flanks were assaulted through side tunnels that had been excavated not by his minions, but by the invaders. His advance lost momentum against the seemingly endless tide of rat-men. For each vermin his skeletons cut down, 2 more took their place. The great necromancer's anger grew as he regretted his decision not to enter the battle personally. Frustrated, he poured more sorcerous power into his minions, seeking the breaking point of the invaders' strength. Ykrit too was wondering how many more resources his foe could throw at them. With only a handful of mineshafts still in their possession, if he did not exhaust the ranks of the undead soon, his clan rats would be pushed back to the very cavern in which he stood. The warlord could wait no longer. He commanded his forces to retreat to the lowest mine shafts, but this was not a rout. Ygritte had one final card to play. The lowest levels were still mostly natural caverns and rough-hewn passageways. In one of the few wide tunnels, the Skaven finally turned and appeared to be making their final stand against the soulless advance of Nagash's skeletons. Battle raged across a 200-yard length of mineshaft. The ebb and flow demanded Nagash's full attention, and as such he did not perceive the trap Ygritte was about to spring. On both flanks and 2 levels behind the front rank of the undead, rough stone walls collapsed under the frantic digging of thousands of claws. The Skaven had been excavating these secret side tunnels for years, in anticipation of their own mining operations once they had seized the mines. From them came a swarm of Skaven slaves, thousands strong, that penetrated deep into Nagash's battle lines, pulling down his skeletal warriors in a sudden onslaught of teeth, claws, shovels, and picks. Where previously the clan rats only held their ground, now they pushed forward with increased ferocity, attempting to break through the front lines of the dead. Nagash now became aware of the sheer scale of the Skaven ambush, its complexity far beyond what he believed them capable of. A third of his army was cut off from reinforcement, and the rest of his forces disjointed, strung out over miles of narrow tunnels. His immediate instinct was to order his forces from the upper levels to try to break through the enemy encircling his front lines, but soon he realized that was futile. The tide of battle had turned once more, and now it was he who would have to retreat. Nagash sent out his orders, and half of his frontline warriors formed a rear guard, while the rest began to withdraw down branch tunnels, fighting through the hordes of flanking Skaven slaves for 3 hours until breaking through. By then, the clan rats had annihilated the rear guard, and alongside their slaves harried the retreating undead, until they came up against the fortifications Nagash had ordered constructed 3 levels above. The invaders threw themselves repeatedly at the defensive positions, but the undead held, and each time the rat men were repulsed with horrific casualties. Eventually, the invaders withdrew to their own hastily formed defensive lines, and the first battle in the war for Cripple Peak had ended in stalemate. Meanwhile, back in Nehekhara, the preeminence of Lahmia, City of the Dawn, continued. The wealth of the city and the leadership of its rulers had led the people of the once blessed land from the brink of disaster wrought by Nagash's reign of terror. Tradition now held that the ruling families of the other great cities sent their heirs to be educated there before returning home once they had come of age. True of all apart from one. He was Alcadizar, heir to the throne of Khemri and ward of Queen Neferata since his birth. He had now reached his 30th year, and although his mother had since passed, his father, King Aten Heru, still ruled Raestra, and the rebuilding of Khemri that had started under his command following the fall of the usurper Nagash. Alcadizar longed to see the father he had never met, and gaze out over the city he planned not only to rule but to raise to greatness once more. Yet the prince had not been allowed to leave the City of Dawn in the decade since he had come of age. All this would change when Alcadizar's uncle, Kenti, a powerful noble from the city of Raestra, sought an audience with Neferata's puppet, the supposed Queen of Lahmia, demanding the prince be passed back into the care of his family. Kenti would be granted a second audience, this time with Neferata, in the Temple of Blood, and Alcadizar was also to attend. The temple was purported to venerate the sacred covenant between the ancient gods of Nehekhara and its people, made flesh in the daughters of the Lahmian royal bloodline. Despite Nagash breaking that covenant centuries earlier, the tradition still appeared to remain. the sole remaining connection to the divine. In truth, the temple was the secret heart of Lahmia's vampiric empire, a fortress and place of refuge for its immortal masters and undying queen, who bore the title of High Priestess. Here they indulged in secret blood rituals and imbibed the elixir created by Arkan the Black and Neferata, in an attempt to recreate the one first discovered and used by Nagash himself. Neferata was defiant that she would not hand over her ward, even though Ashuran, the Lord of Masks, warned her his spies reported that the king of Raestra was growing impatient for the return of his son and heir, and not only warning his nobles to be ready for war, but also reaching out to the other great cities in the hope of gaining their allegiance should the time come to march on Lahmia. When Lord Kenty met Queen Neferata at the Temple of Blood, she subtly lulled his bodyguards with her beguilement, but the old warrior was strong-willed and not so easily brought under her spell. He demanded the Queen of Lahmia release Alcadazar, or admit he was a prisoner, not knowing he was talking to the true Queen of the City of Dawn, hidden behind the golden mask of the High Priestess. Neferata revealed it was not the will of the Lahmian royalty that meant the heir of the throne of Khemri remained at Lahmia. It was at the behest of the temple. The Raestran lord was stunned, but his questions died on his lips as Alcadazar entered the temple's outer sanctum. Kenty greeted the prince with a shout of joy and marveled at the man his nephew had become. Alcadazar's presence had a powerful effect on the mortals he met, his natural confidence and humble empathy eliciting admiration and veneration with ease. He was near worshipped by the common folk of Lahmia. Neferata had been able to suffuse dark magic into Alcadazar when he was still in the womb, but the outcome had been a man that would give even her pause. Truly charismatic, he was blessed not only physically but also with a powerful intellect, a virtual god amongst men. The High Priestess would go on to explain their suspicion from the time of his birth that Alcadazar was from a sacred bloodline, and the lengths the temple had gone to in order to find evidence of such, which she now presented to Kenty in a tome. In truth, the information contained within could not be proven, but it would convince all but the most meticulous of scholars, and all that mattered was that the prince believed it to be the truth. The tome claimed that the lineage of the kings of Raestra were descended from one of the sons of the great Khemrian king Setra. Although that son had been disowned in ages past, the bloodline held true, and Alcadazar bore the birthright of the gods just as the kings of Khemri had done before the coming of the usurper. Neferata proposed a new union between Khemri and Lahmia, one not of flesh but of spirit, united by the shared bloodline once more. The two cities would effectively divide Nehekara between them, with Lahmia passing trade and loan obligations of Zandri, Numas and Kashabar to Khemri, ensuring its growth and prosperity for centuries. But for the union to be consummated, Alcadazar would have to pledge himself to the temple and remain in Lahmia for up to a decade further. If he refused, he would be free to leave without the benefits of the union she proposed. Kenty urged the prince to leave with him immediately, but Alcadazar would not put his desires above what could be best for his people, and despite his uncle's protests, he agreed to remain and let Khemri and Lahmia be united once more. 25 years had passed in Nagashazar. Nagash had extended the lives of leaders of his living warriors through an elixir similar in nature to the one he had given his immortals centuries earlier. The war beneath the mountain had ground on, and showed no signs of ceasing. The massive invasion force the great necromancer had built over the centuries with the aim of retaking his homeland was now severely depleted by the endless tide of vermin that were drawn to the mountain's warpstone riches. With neither side willing to concede defeat, the war was measured and tunnels seized and levels taken. Control of the deeps ebbed and flowed, with neither side strong enough to truly hold any ground they gained from the other. Occasionally the armies would attempt some cunning stratagem, mostly the digging of new tunnels to strike at an unexpected point. But even that was becoming more predictable despite the speed and skill at which the Skaven were able to perform such excavations. Nagash knew a new tact was needed to break the deadlock, and he finally decided to enter the fray directly, using the heathen magic of the witch Akatha to predict the next tunnel breach of the Ratmen. Nagash was waiting for them, accompanied by his living Northman warriors. Once the breach opened, the Skaven invaders were greeted by a storm of magical death from the undying king. Volley after volley of green bolts of power cut through their ranks, boiling blood and erupting from dark-furred bodies as scores were slain, sending the survivors into panic. Nagash waded through the carnage, howling with terrible laughter, as he unleashed his pent-up rage on the vermin scrabbling to get away from him. The Northmen followed their master, roaring their battle cries, and dispatching any Skaven their lord did not immediately slay. All thoughts of strategy was lost to him, and his body was wreathed in a fierce nimbus of green fire that grew fiercer with every spell he unleashed. The Skaven he slaughtered were beyond counting, and it was only when the tunnels led to a wide cavern that he finally paused to take in his surroundings. Panic had spread like wildfire through the ranks of the Skaven in the cavern, and the pack leaders were still struggling to restore some form of discipline as Nagash started raining fire on them once more, and his barbarian warriors charged into the milling horde. The onslaught was too much for the Ratmen, and the great necromancer allowed thoughts of a decisive victory to creep into his mind. But just at that moment, the far end of the chamber was lit by a fierce green glow, and the battle cries of his warriors turned into screams of horror and pain. The onslaught of his warriors became a surging retreat, and Braghag ordered his master to go back just as a gout of green sorcerous flame engulfed a dozen warriors behind him. 4 contraptions of wood and bronze were revealed, each the size of a large war chariot. Each one bore a sealed bronze cauldron attached to great levers that made sounds like furnace bellows as their Skaven operators pulled on them. At the front, a long, flexible pipe was handled by 2 goggle-wearing Ratmen, who were swathed in heavy robes of leather, and their claws covered in similar gauntlets. Nagash saw the green flame flickering within the nozzle as one machine was turned towards him, and soon he would witness firsthand the devastating power of the war machines of Clan Skyer. He knew he could not turn his magic on the machines in such a confined space, so the only way to save himself was to raise up a wall of corpses to block the blast of sorcerous flames that was about to engulf him. His plan barely succeeded, and he retreated swiftly with his remaining warriors to the tunnel from which he had entered, outside the range of the ponderous war machines. Nagash cursed the Ratmen once more for surprising him, and realized he had drained much of his resources in his rampaging assault. On reaching the safety of the tunnel, Nagash paused, and with a final act of rage he sent a hail of bolts into one of the central war machines, puncturing its sealed cauldron and causing it to blow apart in a thunderous detonation that sent jagged shrapnel into the machines on either side, so they too exploded in balls of sorcerous fire. Initially, Warlord Ykrit appeared not to believe the reports that a burning man with eyes of warped stone had single-handedly killed nearly 400 of his troops. From his dais in the great cavern far below Nagashazar's lowest mine workings, the Skaven Lord simmered with rage. His carefully laid plans to distract the frontline forces of the undead with a feint while his war machines were moved into position at the rear had failed spectacularly, and resulted in the loss of thousands of clan rats and slaves, and Vitric's precious machines. Ygritte had personally profited from the war beneath the mountain, of course. Despite the stalemate, he still held some of the richest mine workings, and staggering amounts of warpstone had been plundered and shipped back to Skaven Blight. The war of attrition against the undead was costing him dearly in manpower. Even though reinforcements still arrived, their quality was diminishing with each passing month. The warlord knew that the Council of 13 only tolerated the bloody stalemate because of the riches flowing back to the great city. The ancient seer Queequol had already averted 2 rebellions against Ygritte's leadership, and it would not prove long before the Grey Lords themselves took more direct action. Arriving with a contingent bodyguard of towering storm vermin hundreds strong, Grey Lord Velsqui of Clan Abyss had come from the great city, and Ygritte knew his time in command was over. Over the next few years, the tactics of the Skaven changed. They targeted the hill forts of the Northmen, burrowing up into their midst and slaughtering every man, woman, and child they found, and torching the settlements. Then they did the same to the fetid layers of the Yaghur. Slowly, Nagash realized the purpose of the now sporadic raids was to weaken him and drain his strength twofold. Firstly, he needed to maintain scores of garrisons across the Northlands, while still defending against the constant tunnel raids on his fortress, which drained his energies and divided his attention. Secondly, recruits from the hill forts had all but dried up in the aftermath, and those Northmen under his command were resentful and close to revolt. Officially, Lord Velsqui had no direct authority over the expeditionary force, and Ygritte still held his rank and title. The Grey Lord and his elite storm vermin were simply there to provide assistance and advice to the warlord. It was on this advice that Ygritte would lead the raids on the Northmen and the Yaghur. Velsqui and Queequol had been certain Nagash would respond to the burning of the Yaghur layers by sending his more swiftly moving barbarian forces into the marshes. Ygritte had set an ambush that would become a slaughter, but the retaliation did not come. Nagash had been warned by his witch to expect a trap, and despite his rage, he followed her advice. Instead, he launched a new type of attack on the Ratmen, withdrawing his forces from the lowest mine works still under his command, and using a combination of alchemy and sorcery to send a poisonous mist broiling into the deepest levels that the Skaven occupied. The toxic mist caught Lord Velsqui by surprise, and took a terrible toll on the Skaven as they were forced to evacuate the lowest levels and seek sanctuary above. Ygritte, returning from his foray to the marshlands, saw an opportunity to strike back against Nagash, and possibly regain command of the whole expedition. He led a small force into the upper levels and started to burn the pitch-soaked support beams of the mine, but he was unprepared for how swiftly the flames would spread, and found himself driven by the inferno he created right into the presence of Nagash himself. Caught between the conflagration he had caused and the sorcerous might of the undying king, Ygritte barely escaped with his life. Some 20 years had passed in Lahmia since Alcadazar had agreed to the union of Khemri and Lahmia in the Temple of Blood. Over the centuries since becoming part of Neferata's cabal, the powers granted by the elixir they consumed had caused her immortals to diverge to reflect their true natures. Washoran, the former priest, had become a repellent skeletal figure, but his grasp of the arcane had grown immensely. Zurhas, cousin of the late king, was more furtive and rodent-like, and Ashoran now possessed even greater powers of deception and illusion, a particularly useful trait in his role as Lord of Masks. Of the former king's champion Aborash, it could only be speculated on what his transformation had done to his martial prowess, as he had fled the city shortly after his transformation. Scheming came naturally to Ashoran, and he employed a noted tomb robber to search the trap-laden pyramid of the former Kemrian king Ketep, father of Nagash the Usurper. Once the thief returned, Ashuran would take his prize to the sanctuary of the Temple of Blood, where Neferata ruled through successive generations of Lahmian queens, all enslaved to her from birth. The Lord of Masks met his fellow Cabal member Ashuran in the temple's most heavily warded library, where some of the tomes of Nagash, plundered long ago from his great pyramid and containing a record of all his dark rituals, were held. However, Neferata had forbidden the practice of the necromantic arts and sealed some volumes of Nagash's work in a secret vault elsewhere in the temple. Ashuran's thief had retrieved not gold or jewels from the pyramid of Ketep. He had brought the skull of the doomed king Tutep, brother of Nagash, and it was this that was presented to Ashuran. Placing the skull on a stand of bronze at the center of a summoning circle, Ashuran opened one of the tomes of Nagash and began the invocation he had prepared. But it was not the spirit of Tutep the necromancer was calling. He sought to commune with Nagash himself through the ties of blood to the brother he had entombed alive in their father's pyramid, when he seized the throne of Kemri for himself. An unnatural wind rose and the wails of the dead could be heard growing stronger and stronger. The skull began to smolder and smoke as the ritual progressed, but to Ashuran's displeasure he was forced to allow the doorway to close before Nagash answered his command. The necromancer left perplexed as to why the ritual to call the usurper's spirit had failed. 5 further years passed, and Alcadazar was still being indoctrinated into the Temple of Blood by Neferata, her desire and attraction to him growing with each passing year, becoming an all-consuming obsession. The ceremonies he now partook in under her direction included the ritual letting of his blood for her to consume, and in turn he drank deeply of an elixir made from her blood that swelled his already powerful form with supernatural vigor. The instruction he had received in the 25 years he had spent in the temple was not dissimilar to that received by the Ushabti in ancient times, except where they called on the blessings of the Nehekaran pantheon. He drew upon the power of Neferata's tainted elixir. With the completion of one final ritual, Alcadazar would be anointed the first male high priest of Asaf. Neferata took him by the hand and led him to the inner sanctum, and in that first touch between them, he noticed the deathly cold of her skin. In the secret gardens of the inner sanctum, Neferata promised the prince his initiation would be complete in a few short years. She promised him that his lifespan would be much greater than an mortal man, untouched by the divine, and bade him to gaze upon his own youthful features. Despite his 55 years of life, he would still have plenty of time to raise Kemri to greatness once more. Centuries, she said. However, word came to them that King Aten Haru of Raestra, Alcadazar's father, had died. The throne was now his, and he was urged to return immediately. The message was brought by the former courtesan from Cathay, Nema, and she risked the ire of her mistress by urging Alcadazar to consider leaving the temple. Neferata dismissed the prince and rounded on Nema, who claimed she acted in love of her undying queen. The prince would never be her consort, and once he knew her true nature he would become her sworn enemy. But Neferata would not hear her warnings. For 5 further years Alcadazar remained, becoming more bound to Neferata with each ritual drinking of the elixir, until eventually she deemed the time was right to subject him to the ordeal that would elevate him to the highest rank of the temple. 7 days and 7 nights spent in solitary vigil was ended when she presented him the most potent draught of her elixir yet, swiftly followed by a poisoned chalice of wine. The poison racked his entire body with intense agony that lasted for hours, but he endured. Then he was held by the priestesses while he was lashed with a heavy leather scourge. In Lahmia, 20 lashes was considered a severe punishment, and 40 a death sentence. Al-Qadazar endured 100. Lying barely conscious on the grass of the inner sanctum's garden, Neferata commanded him to rise, and when he painfully did so, she compelled him to come to her embrace. Only then did she slip her dagger between his ribs and into his heart. She lowered him back to the grass, one hand still clutching the hilt of the blade, but Al-Qadazar did not die. One moment seemed to stretch on for eternity, but no darkness came for him. Slowly she withdrew the dagger from his heart, and he felt the tortured muscle spasm and clench, his body withdrawing from the brink of death as he gasped painfully for air once more. His eyes met hers, and she radiated a terrible, almost primal joy as she exclaimed him worthy, before darkness finally took him. When he awoke sometime later, Al-Qadazar looked upon the face of Neferata for the first time, her golden mask removed to reveal her supernatural beauty. His body had already healed most of his wounds, thanks to the elixir, but she offered him another goblet to replenish his strength further. The goblet was borne by an ancient servant Al-Qadazar knew should have perished long before, a man known as Ubayd. However, this time Al-Qadazar resisted. More than that, the sight of the turgid red liquid repulsed him. He questioned how Ubayd could still live if long life was a preserve of the sacred as she had claimed. He also questioned how he could have passed the trial when he knew in his heart he could not dedicate himself to the temple. For the first time he saw he was a victim of sorcery. Neferata was forced to exert her will on the prince, and the years of imbibing her elixir meant he could no longer resist her powers as he once could. With terror rising in his thoughts, he demanded to know her true nature, and she exclaimed to be Neferata, her rule of Lahmia eternal, and he was now hers. Together they would rule Nehekara until the end of time, and with that she forced him to drink. He felt his body responding with unnatural vigor once more, but while previously it had exhilarated him, now he felt only terror and revulsion, and he could feel her grip on him strengthening, crushing what remained of his resistance. Then abruptly it was gone, in a howl of bestial rage. Ubayd had thrown himself at Neferata and broken her hypnotic spell. The ancient retainer was clawing at her eyes like a frenzied animal, and taken completely unawares, Neferata struggled in shock against his attack. Al-Qadazar made to help the old man, but Ubayd urged him to flee just before Neferata seized him by the throat and clamped down on his neck with distended jaws, ripping his head from his shoulders in a plume of gore. Seeing her now for what she truly was, Al-Qadazar leapt through an open window and escaped into the rapidly approaching light of dawn. In Nagashazar, 5 further years passed since Nagash's poisonous mist attack, and Ykrit's retaliationary inferno. The Skaven had recently taken to undermining the great towers of Nagashazar, and once again Ykrit had been tasked with leading the sappers personally. The warlord's previous actions had led to a wide-scale collapse of Mineshaft 7, and triggered a number of cave-ins elsewhere. Lord Velskui had seethed with anger at the disaster, and wished to lay all blame onto Ykrit, but partly this was to divert from his own failings. The poison mist attack had devastated the expedition's forces. Most of his best troops, including the Grey Lord's own contingent of storm vermin, had been slain. Nagash had retaken Mineshaft 8, and would have overrun 9 too, had not it partially collapsed, halting his advance. It had taken all Velsqui's cunning and influence to prevent a full-scale rebellion from the other clans, and a series of assassinations and a hasty alliance with Clan Morbus to secure his position and restore order. The raids on the towers were meant to keep the undead on the back foot while the Skaven rebuilt their strength. They were perilous missions with a high risk of discovery, but the tactic had proven successful. The alliance between the Grey Lord and Lord Hiric had opened Morbus's coffers, and the clan was now funding a replenishment of the expedition force that even included some packmasters of far-off Clan Moldar and their twisted creations. Ygritte had now come to suspect that Velsqui and Queequol had known about the one they called the Burning Man, long before his rampage through the tunnels. He even mused that there could be a traitor in Nagash's ranks, who supplied them with information, possibly as far back as the discovery of the mountain and its hidden warpstone riches. Maybe even Clan Abyss and the Grey Seers planned to seize the plunder for themselves once the forces of the other clans had been depleted sufficiently in the war of attrition against the undead. The great necromancer had unleashed many more sorcerous attacks against the invaders since, from plagues to miasmas to animated constructs, but always the Ratmen came back at his lines. He was now forced to rely more and more on his barbarians to hold the tunnels, and worse, his supply of warpstone was becoming depleted. Forced to rely on the fell substance more and more, his flesh had all but been consumed, and his bones were permeated and held together only by sorcery and his iron will. With each passing year, the strain on his power just to hold his own body together was growing. Time and again, Nagash found himself outflanked by the cunning Skaven, and he knew that eventually he would need to hoard the last of his warpstone, not to continue the fight, but simply to survive. The year was now 1285 before the coming of Sigmar. The Skaven sensed the end of the War of Cripple Peak could be at hand. Ygritte and his raiding parties were now ordered to prepare for a final assault on the fortress, mapping out its storehouses and lower vaults. Now the undead had all but lost the mines below. They ambushed isolated parties of Northmen and flesh-eaters, and set fires in unguarded laboratories and warehouses. Ygritte was actually falsely reporting the strength Nagash still retained, seeking to delay the inevitable victory in the hope the balance of power in the invading army could yet swing his way before the final push. He had to keep Lord Velsqui doubting the moment to strike the decisive blow was at hand. Once the war was over, his life was forfeit. Nagash truly was struggling to maintain what little power he still could command. His reserves of warpstone had dwindled to almost nothing, and the loss of the mine workings meant no more of the precious substance would be coming. His grip on his remaining undead was loosening, and the magic that bound them was beginning to fail as they shed bones while they patrolled the fortress. As he came closer to the embrace of death himself, he was taunted by the spirits of those he had slain in Nehekara, as he had been all those centuries earlier in the wasteland. But the great necromancer had one last scheme, and time was running out to put it into action. Gleaning knowledge of the Skaven leader's new locations from a captured pack leader, he summoned his barbarian immortals and laid out his plan of attack. Nagash claimed the speed of their retreat and their apparent weakness had caused the Ratmen to follow recklessly. Their lines of communication were now stretched, and their leaders drawn much closer to compensate. Now would be the time to strike. The barricades would be all but abandoned, and nearly all their remaining forces would gather for a lightning strike on the Skaven commanders. The Skaven were forewarned of this by their spy, and now both sides laid in ambush for each other. As Nagash's warriors assembled for the final battle, the undying king with his white bodyguard prepared to open a new breach. His forces entered the assault tunnels and moved quickly to block any routes of escape or reinforcement. At first they met no resistance, and then suddenly they were besieged by the vermin. But they were no match for Nagash and his wights, and in mere moments they were fleeing. Grey Lord Velsqui had established a killing ground around the site of his former pavilion. Although the numbers of Nagash's remaining forces were as he expected, the power and ferocity of the great necromancer himself was troubling. Still, there would be no retreat this time. Velsqui ordered Vitric and Queequol to be ready for his signal, and took his place amongst his storm vermin. Nagash found both his thrust and his flanking columns under concerted attack, and his lightning raid had become a pitched battle on all fronts. Still, he urged his men forwards towards the cavern of the Skaven leaders. Bursting into the wide cleared space, Nagash saw hundreds of heavily armoured rat men, armed with heavy bronze polearms, led by a tall warlord in gold-chased armour. A forest of wooden stakes had been driven into the cleared ground, and further back a dais that seethed with an aura of magical energy. When Nagash hurled his first bolts of sorcerous lightning at the Skaven, the power atop the dais sprang into life, and unravelled the weave of his incantation. Again Nagash struck, and again his spell was countered by the wards of the unseen Skaven seer on the dais. The great necromancer would have to use more direct means of vengeance, and ordered his forces to charge the horde of rats. The two sides met in a terrible clash of metal, meat and bone. The first charging Northman died on the extended polearms of the storm vermin, and yet more pressed deeper into the enemy formations, and soon the melee was close and deadly. Nagash sent more arcane bolts towards the dais, but again Queequol was able to dispel them before they reached their target. Unable to lash out with offensive spells, Nagash instead turned to empowering his wights, and they wrought a heavy toll on the ranks of the rat men. The Skaven hurled globes into the Northmen that exploded with gouts of green flame that burned their victims to the bone in an instant. The barbarians wavered under this new assault, and Nagash felt the tide of battle turning against him. He had to reach the Skaven warlord now, or all would be lost. Just as the undying king strode forward, a spear of magical energy struck him between the shoulder blades. The wards of his armor flared into life, but the power of the spell was too great to be deflected, and he fell to the ground closer to death than he had been in centuries. It was Akatha who had struck the treacherous blow. She sent a second spell at him, but this time he was able to utter a counter spell and send some of the bolts back at her in retaliation, but the Skaven seer on the dais protected their newly revealed ally. Rising to his feet, Nagash revealed he had suspected her treachery and attempted to drain her of the vitality granted by his elixir. But she was protected by a subtle yet potent ward. She struck Nagash with another bolt of power and taunted him with how it was she who had lured the Skaven to his fortress to destroy all he had built. But Nagash had indeed planned for this turn of events. The corpses of the rat men slain by his white blade rose to surround the barbarian witch. Akatha screamed in fury and fought with an immortal strength, but the sheer number of claws and teeth bearing down on her was implacable. As soon as the protective talisman around her neck was ripped free, Nagash froze her in place with his iron will, and drained her vitality with pleasure. The undead rat men then tore her withered husk to pieces. Now Nagash sprung his counter-assault at the barricades up above. Long ago he had been assembling a reserve host of undead, armed with his best weapons and armor and far away from the prying eyes of spies. Behind them came a score of fearsome constructs in the guise of scarabs, tomb scorpions and spiders. Some were larger than chariots. With the Skaven elite warriors engaged with Nagash far below, his reserve force faced only slave rats and their masters, who were quickly swept aside, their tenuous morale broken by the well-armored skeletal warriors and constructs. Back in the cavern, Nagash raised yet more of the fallen, but knew between the Grey Seer and the fires his forces couldn't hold much longer. Calling upon his fading reserves, the great necromancer disappeared in a swirl of dust, only to emerge once more in the center of the raised dais. There he now saw his foe Queequeg with his gnarled wooden staff held high, and the one-eyed Lord Vitric of Clan Skyer directing the globe-throwing catapults. Nagash wasted no time with spells. Instead, he grabbed the nearest slave rat and hurled him into the boxes containing the fire globes. With a brittle crack, one of the orbs broke, the resulting ball of flame detonating all the others in a series of devastating explosions. Below the dais, Lord Velsqui was engaged with two of Nagash's wights. His enchanted armor and the protective wards around his neck the only thing preventing him falling to the deadly magic of their blades, as they all but ignored the wounds his sword inflicted on them. Only the desperate intervention of his storm vermin allowed him to prevail and send the wights wailing back into the embrace of death. Freed from the deadly melee, the Grey Lord realized Nagash was nowhere to be seen, and fearful of the explosions on the dais, he moved up the slope to find Queequeg. The detonating fire globes had devastated the dais. Nagash had only survived due to his fell armor absorbing much of the blast, but still red-hot shrapnel had pierced it in several places, and his magical reserves had been further drained. Vitric and his crews were nothing more than a few fragments of blackened bone. Despite his wards and protective talismans, Queequeg had been pierced through the throat by a spike of shrapnel, and now lay dying on the steps of the dais. Before Nagash could put an end to the ancient seer, Velsqui reached him and in bestial rage launched a series of savage blows against the undying king. The warlord was swift and skilled, and in his weakened state Nagash struggled to fend off his assault. However, when the Grey Lord's blade lodged in Nagash's weakened armor, the necromancer seized his opportunity and pulled the warlord from his feet, before hurling him viciously down the steps of the dais. Nagash prepared to cast one last spell to end the cowering Skaven. Only the intervention of Ykrit and Eshrigar prevented his demise. Finding a lone intact globe, the Master of Treacheries took aim and hurled the deadly missile at Nagash. When the flames died down, the great necromancer was gone, and the injured Grey Lord was carried to safety by his storm vermin. Despite his injuries, Velsqui was cunning enough to place Ykrit in charge of the army once more. Any failing now would be on the warlord's head and not his own. Ykrit ordered the retreat, but just before he left the dais he had one last surprise in store. Lord Hirik had also been on the dais when Nagash made his appearance. The Lord of Clan Morbus had cowered beneath the corpses of those slain in the blast. Emerging at last, he was greeted by his old rival Ykrit, and raising his sword, the warlord was not one to forgive the many treacheries of the young Skaven lord. Back in Lahmia, much had changed in the 5 years since Alcadazar had fled the Temple of Blood. Now the hall of reverent contemplation that was Neferata's throne room was little more than a torture chamber, dedicated to her thirst for vengeance. Since that night, the Eternal Queen had abandoned any pretense towards the subjects under her rule. Dispensing with her golden mask, her hatred of the mortal world had grown, as had her distrust of her immortals. In the wake of Alcadazar's escape, Neferata had hunted him herself in the nights that followed, venting her fury in the gruesome murder of many unfortunate citizens. Soon the populace was gripped with terror, and in their hysteria riots and fires broke out across the city, as tales of a cursed flesh-eating spirit grew. Neferata would be persuaded to restrain herself, but she now paid little heed to the matters of state, and of her cabal, only Lord Ankat saw the need to maintain some form of control over the city's affairs. With the passage of time, the powers of each of the immortals had increased, but so did their flaws, becoming more territorial, arrogant, and paranoid. Alcadazar had still not claimed the throne of Khemri despite the years that had passed. When he escaped, all he wished to do was leave the City of Dawn behind and warn Nehekara of the evil that resided in the Temple of Blood. But with the docks and gates of the city crawling with watchmen tasked with his capture, he decided to go to ground in the city despite Neferata's desperate nightly hunts. For 8 months he lived amongst the whores, beggars, and thieves, the lowest castes of Lahmian society. He knew the Eternal Queen still searched for him, but her attention was fixed on the caravans and the travelers' quarter. Carrying what supplies he could, and his appearance changed much since the end of his life of decadence. He was able to slip out of the Eastern Gate and made his way slowly across the wild and lawless Golden Plain. Alcadazar eventually arrived in Liberus, but found no aid in the decrepit streets of the City of Scholars. The royal viziers he approached, refusing him an audience with their king Pashet. A year and a half after his escape, he finally passed through the imposing gates of the city of Rystra. He was pleased to see the city appeared to have prospered under the rule of his younger brother Azar. Knowing Lahmian spies would likely have infiltrated the palace, he made more subtle inquiries, until he was able to locate the home of his uncle Kenti. Although aged by decades since their last meeting, his uncle greeted him with tears of joy. And recounting what he had witnessed in Lahmia, his uncle wasted no time in arranging a secret meeting with his brother in the palace. Asur welcomed him warmly, their kinship clear to them both. But when the prince told his brother the horrifying tale, instead of the righteous fury he had hoped for, his brother simply stared at him and asked, not unkindly, but with measured detachment, what proof he had of his claims. Asur laid out the political situation amongst the great cities. The centuries-old policies of King Lamashazar and Queen Neferata had greatly hindered the other cities' recovery from the war against Nagash. Although all resented Lahmia, none could stand against their military might alone. Alcadazar's discovery would be cause to get the great cities to put aside their mistrust and ambition to form a coalition to defeat Neferata, but only if his claims could be proven without a doubt. Azar made it clear he believed every word his brother had told him, and would do what he could to uncover proof. But Alcadazar knew no outsider had any hope of penetrating the palace compound, let alone the temple. The prince determined that only he could obtain the proof his brother needed to rally the great cities, and made preparation to return to the City of Dawn. However, Neferata had not abandoned her search over the years that had passed, and now, if anything, the hunt was more dreadful than before. The docks and poorer districts were under a constant pall of terror, and he was almost detained immediately by the city guard at the west gate, being forced to fight his way clear and hide from the search parties that were sent after him. Hiding out amongst the bandits of the Golden Plain, Alcadazar hoped to find allies amongst the descendants of the once proud desert tribes that had suffered greatly since Nagash had severed the ties to their patron god Khazar. But they were a secretive people, and despite a year on the plain, he could not gain their trust, and was forced to join one of the more desperate bands of common outlaws. Eventually, an opportunity did present itself to him. One band of desert raiders was lured into attacking a Lahmian caravan in what proved to be a trap, with well-armed and prepared soldiers disguised as simple merchant guards. The chieftain of the tribe had been pinned down in the ambush, and honor dictated his men rescue him or die trying. With Lahmian cavalry swiftly approaching the site of the ambush, Alcadazar knew he had but moments to act. He spurred his horse into a gallop and plunged into the encircling Lahmian soldiers, felling them left and right before reaching the desert chieftain and offering him his hand. Swinging deftly into the saddle behind Alcadazar, the two rode not out into the open plain, but down towards the startled onrushing cavalry, and using them as a shield from the caravan's archers. they made good their escape. The young chieftain was named Fazir al-Hashim, and with his rescue Al-Qadazar had at last gained what he sought, acceptance into one of the proud desert tribes. For 20 years, until 1265 before Sigmar, under the name of Ubaid, in honour of the servant who had saved his life, Al-Qadazar rode with Fazir al-Hashim and his people. The Bani al-Hashim were now one of the most famous and wealthy of all the desert tribes. Al-Qadazar had counselled and guided the charismatic but impulsive Fazir, and his knowledge of the Lahmians had proven invaluable in their daring raids. Now they approached the great gathering of the desert tribes, and the prince was preparing for the trial that would prove his worthiness to join them. There had been other gatherings, but this was the first Al-Qadazar was allowed to attend. For all his contributions to their good fortune and the trust in which he was held, he was still an outsider in the eyes of the desert people. Al-Qadazar knew the desert tribes had ways to get word to and from their kinsfolk in the city, but as yet these secrets were not shared with him. He hoped his trial at the gathering would change that. The prince studied the ways of the tribes and realized that despite his popularity, Fazir had little political influence with the other tribes. That was held by Bashir al-Rakuba, chieftain of the richest and most powerful desert tribe, and there appeared to be little love lost between the two leaders. That evening, Al-Qadazar waited to be presented at the gathering of chiefs. When the time came, it was nearly midnight, and his long wait only broken by the brief appearance of a young maiden with yellow leonine eyes who observed him wordlessly for a few minutes before he was summoned. Inside the tent, seated at an ornate table, the gathered chiefs observed as Fazir presented him. He recounted his deeds, the men he had slain while riding with his tribe, and the times his own life had been saved by the prince. Bashir would accuse Al-Qadazar of being unworthy to join the desert tribes, claiming him both an outsider, a city dweller, and potentially a Lahmian spy. The hot-blooded Fazir leapt to his defense, and called on any man that doubted the one he knew simply as Ubaid to put him to the test by wit, blade, or horse. This was what Bashir had hoped for, but before the older chieftain could proceed with his plan, there was an interjection that surprised them all. The black-robed chosen man of Khazar, god of the wastelands, brought his staff down on the table in a thunderous blow, and intoned that the daughter of the sands would be heard. The only woman at the gathering of the chiefs, proud and strong despite the frailty of her body, brought on by her advanced years, rose slowly from her chair, and the chiefs all fell silent. Her eyes the same leonine yellow as the young girl he had seen outside. The old woman questioned whether he had observed all the customs of adoption, shed his blood for the tribe, and set aside his past life to devote himself entirely to their people. Fazir confirmed he had, although Al-Qadazar did interject to say he could set aside his past life only as much as any man could be expected to forget the people and place of their birth. The daughter of the sands stared at him for a long moment, and then declared him one of the Bani al-Hashim, a true son of the tribe. Bashir started to protest, but her authority over this matter was clear to all. Her word final. They left the gathering, and Fazir said he had never known the daughter of the sands to take a hand in tribal matters. She used to serve as an advisor to the Al-Qadazar, the chief of chiefs, but there hadn't been one of those since the war against the usurper. The year was now 1250 before Sigmar, and in Nagash it had been 35 years since the battle in the cavern. Warlord Ikrit was still in command. In the days following the devastating battle, he had rallied the other clans, and finally been able to hold a defensive line at the 8th mineshaft. When he finally made his way back to his former quarters in the Underfortress weeks later, Velskui was gone, returned to the great city. Ikrit did what he could to repair the damage to both his expeditionary force and his reputation. ensuring the shipments of warpstone resumed and making the political decision to thank the Grey Lord for his years of support, tying their fates together as best he could. Some of the clans had lost so much in the costly war that their positions on the Council of 13 was threatened. Clan Morbus was the first to withdraw its warriors, and Clan Skyre soon followed. Worse, Nagash was now in possession of new stores of warpstone, and using its power his minions were slowly driving the Skaven from his mountain. Now they held only the Underfortress and the deepest mine shaft. Velsqui would return to the mountain, but the news he bore was dire. The Council wanted no more to do with this war. No other Grey Lord would support them, and no reinforcements were coming. The alliance of the clans was to dissolve, and the expeditionary force disband. The Grey Lord told Ygritte of Queequol's visions of what the great necromancer planned, how he hoped to bring death to all, including the Skaven. This was truly why they had come to the mountain, but now he urged the warlord his only option was to take whatever riches he could and abandon it to its master, and hope he never succeeded in his scheme to bring eternal night to the mortal races. However, a strange turn of events unfolded. Nagash, right at the moment of his ultimate victory, offered the Skaven terms. If the Ratmen abandoned the mountain, the great necromancer would agree to provide them with the warpstone they desired in exchange for slaves and other tribute. He offered them a simple choice: withdraw and trade, or stay and die. Ygritte was loath to agree after 40 years of constant war against the undead, but Velsqui once more took charge and agreed Nagash's terms. They would both grow rich from controlling the trade from the mountain, and by staying close, they could still try to learn Nagash's true motives. And if their ancient Grey Seer had been right about the existential threat he posed to all life, maybe they could find the right moment to strike. It had been 25 years since Al-Qadazar had been accepted into the desert tribes, and now the Bani al-Hashim were considered the greatest of them all. Now Fasir and Al-Qadazar organized a raid on one of the outer fortresses of the Lahmians. Fasir for the plunder, Al-Qadazar to gauge the capabilities of his adopted people when the time came to strike against the City of Dawn itself. They were successful, and in doing so Al-Qadazar learned how demoralized the Lahmians now truly were, but then word reached them that the aged daughter of the Sands had died. At the somber gathering that followed, Al-Qadazar would speak to Ophelia, the young woman he had seen just before his acceptance into the tribes, and soon to be the new bride of Kassar, daughter of the Sands. She asked him why he still hid his true name, and when he told her the truth, she listened intently to his story. She asked what would become of her people once they had served his purpose. Al-Qadazar swore he would remain loyal to his oaths to the tribe, and asked her what they would truly want from him should he ascend to the throne of Khemri. The answer Ophelia gave was simple: forgiveness. In the days of Setra, the desert tribes had come closer than any other army to defeating the mighty king of Khemri. When he eventually prevailed, the surviving chiefs swore oaths to serve and protect his kingdoms. Oaths they kept until Nagash the usurper waged his dreadful war. She recounted how Arkan had taken vengeance on their people after the great necromancer's defeat at the Battle of Zandri. Despite Nagash's eventual defeat, Khazar had forsaken them. They were forced to leave the desert and wander in shame until a prophecy received in a vision was fulfilled. A prophecy that from the City of Dawn the next king of Khemri would rise, and the old oath would be made anew. This was why the aged daughter of Sands had spoken to accept him into the tribes, and now this was the oath Ophelia wished him to honour. In Nagashazar the year was now 1222 before the coming of Sigmar. The undying king had been confined to the throne of his great chamber ever since the Battle of the Cavern. The wounds from Akathar's magical assault had refused to heal no matter how much power he used, and the fire globe of the Skaven had disrupted his bones' ability to store the magical energies of the warpstone as they had done before. His grip on the physical world was deteriorating. Despite his apparent ascendancy in their war, Nagash knew his strength was failing. He had been forced to negotiate while the Ratmen still believed he was strong enough to drive them out if he wished. With the peace that came, he would turn his attention back to vengeance on Neferata, using warpstone carved with complex sigils of power, lead and gromril plundered by the Skaven from the dwarven realms. Nagash, alongside his remaining immortal barbarian leaders, performed incantations of immense power to forge a suit of armor unlike any the world had ever seen. For hours, the completed pieces of armor were placed one after another atop Nagash's skeleton and fused into place, creating a suit of all-enclosing armor, more complex than anything created by human hands. As he was encased in the terrible armor, the constant draining of power from his bones ceased. The energies of the wards he'd carefully laid around the great chamber flowed towards him, sinking into the metal and becoming trapped within, his strength growing with every moment. With the final piece in place, the black armor of Nagash was complete. Only his skull was left exposed, floating on cold, sorcerous flame above the throat of the breastplate. His immortals had been ravaged by the tempestuous energies unleashed during its creation, but Nagash did not care. They had served their purpose, and with a word he stripped them of their power and cast their souls into the realms of the dead. Now the undying king had one more task to perform. Taking the last of the magical ore from the crucible, he began a final incantation, one more powerful and complex than the others that had preceded it. The metal formed into a crude disc that Nagash poured more magical energy into. Inside the disc itself, he was creating a specific structure, one similar to the one he had built in the Black Pyramid centuries earlier. Satisfied with his work, Nagash took the disc, and chanting the words of a final terrible incantation, he hammered the metal on an anvil of bronze, until slowly a heavy, wide circlet was formed, infused not just with magical power, but also with all his bitter memories of triumph and failure. But most of all, he filled it with his lust for vengeance, and a desire to rule all mankind. The hammer fell tirelessly. The cruel and graceless crown he forged would magnify his powers 1,000-fold. Both potent tool and symbol of his desire to rule the darkness he would bring as king over the realm of the dead. Tossing aside the hammer, he finally placed the crown of sorcery on his brow, and darkness fell over Nagashazar. I hope you've enjoyed our journey together, and I've earned your subscription today, and I'll see you again in the near future, where there is only war.